Welcome to Fringe Pop 321, the show that believes the world is stranger than we think, but thinking should not be strange. We have a special episode of Fringe Pop today. We have a special guest. Jen is with us, and she wants to share her story with us, and we want to hear it. And specifically, I'm interested in your story because I've heard a longer version of it, and it's really a story of how you, even as a Christian, even someone who knew about Jesus, had heard about Jesus, had embraced, him as Savior. Again, sort of theologically, you knew all the I's were all dotted, the T's were all crossed. But you got into the occult. So we want to talk about how you got in and then how you got out. So let's just start there. How did you get involved in this? Take us through, as much of the story as you care to, and whatever detail you want.
Sure. I'd say I've always had a supernatural worldview. I started seeing things when I was really young, probably about 3 or 4 was the first time I ever saw what I guess I thought was a ghost at the time, which I know better now. But I always saw things and heard things, so I always knew that there was something else out there beyond our physical world. And so when I was involved in church, there was never any talk of the supernatural, nothing that could explain what I was seeing other than it was just my imagination or, just a young kid. And that wasn't good enough for me. Like what I was seeing was absolutely 100% real.
How old were you when it first popped into your head to ask somebody at church? Do you remember how far back that goes?
I never brought it up in church because it was always explained away by my parents.
Okay.
And my mom was a Christian, and we just went with what my dad said, who wasn't really a strong believer. He believed in Jesus, but that was it. But he's just, it's not real. It's your imagination, which I think he was just saying that to, calm his small child down. But I think ultimately he knew better.
So you're kind of like going to church thinking, well, if, I may hear something about it and that might validate, that might tell my parents that, hey, I'm not just imagining this, but you never did.
No, there was never, I went to a Methodist church, started out Presbyterian, then switched to Methodist, but no, there was never any talk other than Jesus expelled demons, but they don't really talk about those too much in Sunday school class.
Right. So how frequent was this?
We went every Sunday when I was a kid in elementary school, and then eventually sleeping in was more important. And so my mom ended up kind of giving us the choice, and I kind of opted out of it because it was boring. There was nothing interesting about it. Or if I did go, I'd work in the nursery and not have to go to big church.
Right. Now during that time, you're seeing things or other experiences. Did that continue, or was it intermittent? How would you describe it?
It was pretty intermittent. There was one particular room in my house that seemed to have more instances than the other. And so when I moved out of that room, I'm the youngest of 4, and so we were always kind of switching rooms and stuff. And it would subside for a while, and it would be out of my mind. I wouldn't think about it. And then something would happen again, like if I was just sleeping with my sister in her room, having a slumber party or whatever. It'd freak me out. But of course, I'd run downstairs in the middle of the night and say, there's somebody in my room. And my dad's an ex-cop, so that didn't bode too well. So he'd grab his gun out of the side table and run upstairs and then get mad that there wasn't anyone in my room.
Right. How about your siblings? Did this happen to any of them?
My sister, I think, said one time she saw something out the window, but I don't think my sisters were as sensitive. My brother, later on, admitted that he experienced and saw weird stuff, especially when my grandmother came and lived with us for a little while. She was almost full-blood Cherokee. My dad was almost half. And she had, I wouldn't say powers or abilities, but she could just do weird stuff. Like she could push a table across the room, almost like levitate it. She couldn't wear watches. They would stop on her. And she was just a weird and interesting old lady.
That's actually a little bit like my family on my mom's side. My aunt looks, again, without getting into the stories of, my own, but if I showed you a picture of my aunt, it would be like she came right off the reservation.
Right.
So I don't know what degree, she was, and, the bloodlines and all that kind of stuff. But my mom, told me a few times of incidents, either with her, my aunt, or, one of her sisters or something like that. And interesting, you mentioned the table. That was always one of the family stories, that kind of thing. So that's actually a little bit familiar. Now, as you're older and you look back on that, is there any pattern to this? In other words, do you have like why us? Why me? Why this room? Did you ever really put some thought into it, or?
Well, at the time, our house was pretty new. It had been, when we moved into it, it was only about 5 or 6 years old. And my mom told me later that the man who built it was in like his 70s, and he became obsessed with building our house. It's all he could think about. And then once it was done and they moved in, he had a stroke, and immediately they had to sell it and move out. And it was built on old farmland. And so we'd always find arrowheads in the backyard. It was 3/4 of an acre, but still in the city. So we had quite a bit of land for the neighborhood we lived in, huge backyard. And there's like the metal stakes that stick out of trees that you hang animal carcasses on to bloodlet them. And so, yeah, I think honestly there was something up with that land.
So, but you never actually checked, like it was never actually zoned like, tribal land or something like that?
No, I never got that far into it.
Okay.
But there was definitely, like, we couldn't grow things in the front yard. At one point, a tree, like a 150-year-old oak tree, just fell one day on our house. There was a huge ant infestation. And
sounds awesome. This is like the place to be.
It was awful. Like my mom and I talk about it now. That house was awful. Like whatever was on that land or in that house was trying to destroy whatever family that lived there. Yeah. And it almost very well succeeded.
Okay, since that was such a freaky experience, right? How would you, with given that background, why would you find the occult attractive? I mean, how did you get involved personally with that sort of stuff?
I think there's several answers to that question. Knowing about my Native American Cherokee heritage, my dad was not forthcoming. He did live on a Native American reservation, and he just wouldn't talk about his past. Like you could not ask him questions. He was a pretty bad alcoholic, and so he wasn't the friendliest of guys to talk to anyway. And so I started researching Cherokee, just heritage and trying to discover my lineage. And in the process, coming across like some of their beliefs and religion and shamanistic type beliefs. And it was like, okay, well, here are some answers. Like, this is actually
Right. So that stuff like incorporates what you've experienced.
Yeah.
So,
They
there
had
was some kind of connection there.
they had a very distinctive supernatural worldview where they didn't explain it away. It was very, very real to them. And I was like, okay, well, that kind of answers some questions. And there was a Native American store in this neighborhood in Atlanta that I grew up in called Little Five Points, which is was kind of a hippie punk little neighborhood. And so I would go there and do research along with the library. But when I would go there, there was another store across the street called Crystal Blue, which was a pretty big New Age store. So when I'd have, my mom would drop me off down there, and I just kind of walk around and go to the stores. And I stumbled in there, and I've always been an avid reader, and so immediately just pick up books, and I'm like, oh, here are some more explanations.
Right. So there was stuff in what we would loosely call the New Age.
Right.
That resonated with you.
Right.
Right. But you didn't feel good about that.
No, there was this kind of taboo, I shouldn't be doing this, kind of sneaking a cigarette, behind your mom's back type thing to it. And then I also knew enough of what to stay away from, the dark side of it, if you will. So, I was deceived into thinking, well, it's, white light magic. It's totally fine, I also feel like there was also a guy I liked in high school that was unrequited. And so there was a certain level of control, I guess, since things were crazy at my house. I was the youngest. My dad was an alcoholic. It was a terrible environment, always fighting. And so it was, I guess, the only semblance of control I felt like I had, because it became more of a curiosity. I started buying the candles and set up an altar in my bedroom. I had 2 closets and one was empty. And so I set up a secret altar in there with candles, doing spells. So it turned into more than just a curiosity.
So, a couple of questions.
Okay.
So you mentioned the word control. So correct me if I'm wrong here. You were in your head, thinking, okay, there's a clear demarcation here. There's the good witch and there's the bad witch. Okay, there's the good side, the light, and then there's this other. And you thought you could both navigate that and control it.
Absolutely.
Okay.
At 16.
Okay.
15 and 16 years old.
Right.
Absolutely.
And what made you feel that way? Just the fact that you could sort of mentally, it's going to sound odd, but mentally articulate the difference. And, since I know there's a difference, I know which place I'll be at. Was it something that simple, or was it something experiential that just convinced you?
Well, when it started to work,
okay.
Little things started to happen, I'd do a spell and to have a good day or manifest positive energy, and the next day at school wouldn't suck, which was, I hated school. I hated everything in my life pretty much. And so this is the one thing that kind of grounded me, oddly enough.
How much of that do you think was sort of self-fulfilling prophecy? In other words, you would do this spell, then you would go into the next day, and then I imagine you would consciously look for ways to validate this thing you had just done. So how much of it was that, as opposed to you really believe that there was something going on here?
At the time, I actually believed that it was something I was doing. Obviously, looking back on it now, most of it probably was a subconscious consciousness of.
You filtered your day through it, and then it's like you would interpret your day in light of that.
Exactly, but whatever the reason, it was working in my mind.
That's still control.
Right.
Right. It just gives you a filter.
Right.
And you control that.
Either meditating on something positive, or lighting a candle and scrying into the candle and trying to manifest your day the next day. Yeah, I mean, it worked.
All right, so let's get into what I'm sure people are going to be curious, and without like, going into too many details. But what are the candles for? You use the word altar. Now, are you worshiping something, or is this just a sort of a place to localize a certain, for lack of a better term, spiritual discipline?
So I wasn't worshiping an entity or praying to anything. And if I was, I would mix Jesus in with it, like, because that made me feel better too. Well, I mean, I'm just praying to Jesus and lighting some candles. What's the harm in that?
You want somebody on the other side on your side.
Right.
Yeah.
And so the different candles that you would light in different orders would manifest different things. Like, I mean, it's so silly now, but like a green candle, if you wanted more money, a red candle, like positive energy or love. I think I stayed away from the black candles because that's if you wanted something bad to happen to somebody, and would light the candle and say a mantra and focus it into the flame.
If you were following the directions,
right,
like
it was
following the spell, then there was an outcome you would expect.
Exactly.
And then as you go into your day, you're looking for that outcome.
Right, just like following a recipe, like baking. If you followed it to the T exactly, out would come this awesome chocolate cake that would taste amazing.
And then when certain things would happen, again, you filter those events through the expectation of the outcome. And there we go.
Right.
Believe it or not, this I don't know, it's probably about 10 years ago now, I was at a regional American Academy of Religion meeting. Okay, this is one of the scholar geek fests, okay? But I went to a regional meeting, and specifically I went to this one session because of the guy doing the session. His name was Jordan Paper, and I think he was retiring at that point. But I had just read his book on a polytheistic theology, and he was a practicing polytheist.
Really?
And so his session was about essentially, what do polytheists do? And he would describe what he did in very similar terms. In other words, you had to sort of volunteer yourself for experience. In other words, you had to solicit some kind of outcome or experience. And you might do this or that, out of some religious tradition or whatever, something that had lots of gods. And you're going to do that little ritual, or you're going to observe this little festival or this important day or something like that.
Right.
But then as you go through your day, there would be things that would happen to you that another person would say, well, that's a synchronicity, or that's a providence, or that's nothing at all. But you would filter everything that, it was essentially part of your day through this idea that the gods were present.
Right.
Right, and sort of like helping you out. So even, again, here, this guy has a PhD, he taught religion at some school, but he's describing the same thing.
Yeah, essentially.
And that's literally like how it's done. So here you have a guy, again, American Academy of Religion, the guy is a PhD, practicing polytheist, but he was approaching his day just like you described. There's this expectation of a certain outcome, and that filters his day.
Right.
So I just thought that was really striking because, somebody watching this could think, well, good grief, this is a high school girl, and this is all kind of silly. No, actually, there are people who are, he was retirement age. And again, he's got all these academic credentials and whatnot. He's published in journals, and he's doing exactly the same thing. It just sounds more impressive.
Well, it kind of makes me feel better that I wasn't just, some dumb 15, 16-year-old girl that there was actually, I mean, it is dumb, but you know what I'm saying.
You don't want to call him dumb, but it's okay.
Right.
We can do that.
And in my mind, I believed in a God, and it was angels helping me as opposed to like multiple gods or whatever,
right. Spiritual forces.
Right,
yeah,
because
you don't even have to name them.
My mom did tell me that Hinduism is bad, so I knew to stay away from that side kind of as well.
It's really interesting how you have these boundaries.
Right.
But then there's this this arena that is sort of getting mixed, or I don't know what the right word is, married to Christianity, but then it's like this Christian, it's like the Christian occult.
Which
or
is
occult
actually,
Christianity.
yeah, I mean, I see it everywhere now. There is
Okay,
totally...
give us some examples.
Contemplative prayer.
Okay.
That's going on in a lot of, I guess, the emergent church, if you will, where you sit down and you focus and you say a mantra over and over, and you manifest your reality. I mean, there's books talking about creating your own reality, designing your reality with God. And I believe in being a co-laborer with God, but I'm not sure I'm sold on being able to just say, okay, God, this is how I'm going to make it look. I mean, it's still got to...
He's going to share his phenomenal cosmic power with you.
Right. And I mean, we are, you know, made in his image and able to create reality, but as long as it's in his will.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, how about, you brought that up, how about, I'm trying to remember the right word, I don't know if it's mandala or you know, that there's like these labyrinth things,
yeah,
you know, like you walk according to these things, and there are stations. And
yeah, it's a prayer
labyrinth.
Okay, yeah.
I remember when those came out, you know, it's been a while now, but I remember coming across, again, academic discussion, like, you know, because I tend to read that kind of stuff. So that was being questioned, and those sorts of practices by religious scholars who knew where those practices were used elsewhere, outside the realm of Christianity. And I can remember reading things about those practices, and scholars essentially, both Christian and non-Christian, asking, what are they doing here? You know, like why would they be adopting this? And some thought, well, that's kind of good because, you know, we're all one and all that kind of stuff. But others would say, don't Christians realize what the roots of this are? And apparently the answer is no.
No, they don't. I read an article not several weeks ago where there are Baptist churches, opening up labyrinths and doing contemplative prayer and, you know, urging their congregants to walk these labyrinths. That it's they didn't use the word transcendental, but it's experiential. It's all about the experience with God. And so there's no real relationship unless you experience him. And so that's what these practices are for. And they have no idea where they came from.
Yeah. Yeah, we could go a long time on that because to me that...
Don't even get me started on holy yoga.
Well, yeah, holy yoga. I was thinking a little more simply than that, and a little less strenuously than that.
Sorry.
But I was thinking of the fact that what happens in a church service now is so geared toward entertainment that and I'm not using this term pejoratively, but anything that you would sort of file under an encounter with God, that's just out the window. Okay, now it's this sort of entertainment focus, and since we've lost it there, we have to sort of build it or reconstruct it somewhere else. And so now we have these other activities that will connect you with God, instead of like what happens on a Sunday morning, you know, in church, you know, where there is no liturgy, there's like almost no purpose to what we're doing other than to sort of elicit some emotional response and get us ready for the next thing that comes along. So there's no real encounter there in a kind of rooted sort of, I can encounter with God, meaning that I'm actually thinking, I hate to put it this way, but I'm thinking theological thoughts. I'm thinking about God and my relationship to him, as opposed to I'm just feeling something that I wouldn't like feel if I was making toast at home, okay? And now that, you know, it's hard to distinguish between, you know, what the goal of encountering God would be in a spiritual sense, as opposed to some heightened emotion.
And that's what can be so deceptive too, is it an actual experience with God, or is it just some sort of elicited emotion from lights or, a mantra that you said over and over. God is supposed to worship our praise. And so I believe that when I'm in worship on Sunday morning, I am feeling the presence of God, but who's to say it's not being manipulated by the lights and the music and the repetition of the lyrics of the modern worship songs over and over. So it is really, I would say...
You'd almost have to have some substance, you'd have to have some substance internally to kind of know what you should be thinking about, because if you really have an encounter with God, you should be thinking about, your own sin, your need for repentance, that God loves you He loves you in spite of what you are. In other words, these are theological thoughts that orient the relationship the way it should be. He's here, you're here, but yet he loves you, wants you to be part of his family, and all those big picture theological things that are wonderful, but they stem from a recognition of really who made all that possible, as opposed to, man, I just feel good now.
Yeah,
This is fun.
Yeah, I'm focused on my emotion. Yeah. That's...
And if people don't actually consciously think about that, then a conversation like we're having now would be totally meaningless. Like if they've never actually been led to think about what's going on inside of me.
Right.
Or
what... I don't know, maybe if my time spent in the occult, like I'm able to differentiate those thoughts or feelings, but when I'm in worship, I'm like, I can't even believe, like, with all that I've done and all that I've said against him, like, he's still here and loves me. And that's, I'll just start weeping. And so I know that that's a true experience and encounter with God.
So how do you think this works with other people? Like, what are some of the other reasons other kids, even other adults, get drawn into the occult?
Like I said earlier, I think there was a different number of reasons for me. Another one, and probably a huge reason for others, is drug use. I started drinking, and I didn't really like pot. I just kind of jumped into the LSD and the mind-expanding drugs. And so just that didn't help at all. When you can see...
Did it help you have experiences?
It did. It helped me with the occult side of things and experiencing what I was assuming were parallel realities and being able to see into other worlds and from a different perception, if you will. And it didn't help my sanity.
So did it encourage you, like, oh, this occult stuff is even more real now, and I'm going to get even more involved in it, and
absolutely.
So it was sort of this thing behind you now, like pushing you down the road a little bit.
Absolutely. So
what were some? Where did it take you?
I didn't. Like, I just always wanted to drop acid. Like, that was when I was tripping.
You wanted to visit the other side.
That was more real to me than my own reality. And that's where I wanted to live. And so, obviously I understand now that the depression and everything, when you come down, you experience, that's all has to do with neurochemicals and everything, but I already was diagnosed with clinical depression, so it just added to that. And so I had this one friend, and she just found it. I don't know, I didn't have to pay for it. I don't know what it was. She just always had it. And so it put me in dangerous situations. Like, we would drop acid at my house with my parents downstairs, my dad being an ex-cop. Like, it was insane when I look back on it now, the things that I would do.
Were they always positive experiences? In other words, nothing that would just terrify you? I mean, how would you describe that? It had to be mostly positive.
Yeah, at that point,
to keep doing it.
They were mostly positive. I would, see things in my wooden door, which pareidolia.
Yeah.
But I think I saw a demon in my closet door. So from there on out, I could never look or have my closet door open ever again.
Mm-hmm.
I did see like freaky things in mirrors. And so literally until I was like 29 or 30, I couldn't have a mirror in my bedroom ever. I never had a bad experience until New Year's 1999. And so it just perpetuated. And so I started experimenting with other drugs, and that just kind of...
Did you adopt other occult practices? I mean, what?
Yeah, I started reading tarot.
What were the building blocks there?
So then I got into tarot in high school. My mom actually found a deck a friend of mine lent me and took it away and was like, I can't believe you have this. And I always stayed away from Ouija boards. Those freaked me out. But trying to divine the future, trying to communicate with the other realm, started getting into... I guess sort of the monsters like vampires. And then I really started researching UFOs, I guess, after I started watching X-Files. Because that was the one thing my family did together on Sunday nights. Okay. My dad was a sci-fi freak, and so it was the one thing he would do with us.
Well, it's interesting. Again, you run on these parallel tracks, even though you wouldn't have what you'd call a good spiritual influence or a spiritual family in an overtly or consistently Christian way, but you still had these runners, like kind of like the when you go bowling, the bumpers,
oh yeah,
all that kind of stuff. So you still had those. But you were into all this other stuff.
And I was still going to youth group on Sunday nights.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, all right. Well, okay, who at youth group, did anybody at youth group know this?
No,
I mean... The other Jen, did they know the other Jen?
No.
It never slipped out?
Well, I just never talked about it. It wasn't... I think once I started getting into the drugs, obviously I stopped going to church at Sunday night youth group. It was basically when I switched high schools.
Okay.
Because I'm the youngest of four, and so I went into high school with this stigma of all my older siblings. Like I was the kid, and so I wanted to cut that off and not be associated with them, and switch schools, and then stop going to church. And
so let's fast forward. I mean, what started? What were the give us a couple sort of pivotal events, or again little strings of providence that started to draw you out? What woke you up?
From the occult?
From the occult, from all this stuff. I mean, what was the give us, if you can, kind of like a moment where you just sort of realize that this really isn't good. In other words, I need to break ties with the other side, and defined as the occult stuff. I need to put the kibosh to that.
I started getting a little more into. I started going late in life. I went back to school, going to school for science. So I started really getting into like quantum physics, and I was taking a philosophy class, and I was doing my honors paper on, I wanted to unify somehow or explain quantum physics through the lens of Christianity, because at this point I'm like, that seems to be the main worldview. I had ordered a bunch of books off of eBay, like this, a lot of books on Tesla and quantum physics. And I see now it was divine providence. There was a Tom Horn book thrown in there, Nephilim Stargate in the year 2012. And so I read it and I was like, whoa, that is the answer to everything. Like, everything I've believed makes sense through, like, all the gods are real. They're all just fallen angels. Like, it all makes sense. And so, but I was still like not ready to come out yet. So it planted the seeds.
Right. So you latched on to something. Okay, here's something that has, let's just describe it this way. Here's something that has some biblical tether. I mean, it's tethered back into this thing we call the Bible, okay? But those tethering points were essentially, bridges to, again, this stuff you were into, maybe experiences that you had, but now you could see some biblical attachment to that.
Right. I had never, in all my research and reading, and I had never seen Christianity, mainstream Christianity, have a supernatural worldview. They just didn't discuss it.
That's worth repeating. Okay. You had never experienced.
No.
You had never encountered a Christianity that had a supernatural worldview.
No, that had an explanation to
that
this.
Ought to be a poster somewhere.
I figured you would probably, of all people, appreciate that. Yeah. There was no explanation. And so I think that is another reason why people start looking to the occult. They're experiencing these things. They know to be real. They're not insane. They're highly logical, intelligent people, but there's just no mainstream explanation in Christianity.
Even if they're not experiencing things, they have the questions.
Right.
Right. They'll see something on TV, they'll read a book, and their mind will be taken down this path on this subject, and it's really intriguing. And if they can't find some biblical connection to it, then at that point, the Bible becomes irrelevant. And if you pile up 3 or 4 or 5 or half a dozen of those, then the Bible starts to look even more irrelevant.
Right.
And it kind of reinforces a pattern of thinking, about the Bible or about Christianity.
Because I believed in UFOs, but I couldn't reconcile, if there are other beings out there, then why did Jesus only come die for us? But I know they're out there.
Yeah, that whole can of worms.
Yeah,
right.
So I was just I threw Jesus out.
Right,
yeah.
It's a very normal question. If you can't either find some way to think biblically or Christianly about this thing, well, that's not a problem for the thing. That's a problem for the Bible. It's that kind of thought process.
But a friend had given me. Rewind a little bit, The Dancing Wooly Masters by Gary Zukav. And so that kind of opened my mind to like legitimate alternate universes and parallel universes, not just like the ones that I experienced drug-induced.
Right.
But there's a scientific explanation getting into the quantum physics. And so that helped. And when I started looking at these beings as maybe interdimensional as opposed to physical, that helped a lot. And like, okay. So then I got this movie called What the Bleep Do We Know? And I was like, this is amazing. Like, this is awesome. But then I realized that it was produced by Jay-Z Knight, and her whole, I guess, she has her own religion, if you will. And I was like, wait, there's an agenda behind this. This isn't just for, pure scientific thought. There's a spiritual agenda behind this. And so then I watched Zeitgeist. I was like, there's agendas behind every single one of these. And I just, my eyes started opening up like, okay, so what are these beings these people are talking to or communicating with? And I don't know. I know for a fact my mom was in another state praying for me this whole time. So I guess the scales just started to fall off my eyes.
You began to think you'd already accepted the other side as real, but now you're starting to assign some intelligence to it.
Yes.
Okay, and if you begin to assign intelligence to it, then intelligence by definition is going to have goals. It's going to have an agenda. It's going to have a purpose. It's going to think purposefully.
Right.
And so then you start to ask the questions, well, what is the other, what is that intelligence, how does it approach me? How does it approach humanity? And once you start asking those kind of questions, you sort of invariably stumble back into the Bible.
Exactly. Yeah. And I was seeking truth. And the Bible says, you seek me, seek truth, you will find it. Mm-hmm. And so those questions of I've always had a conspiratorial worldview as well. Always been a conspiracy theorist. Always believed in the Illuminati. Always believed that there is a nefarious side.
So Tom's book was perfect.
I know. I mean, if nothing else in my life, divine providence, that little seed, and it was a lot of books on trying to manifest your psychic abilities in Tesla, and there's no reason in the world this book should be in there whatsoever.
Right.
And so it did. It sat on my bookshelf.
But you could see as other people, again, let's put it this way, as non-Christian writers were talking about this stuff, quantum physics, this sort of 0 point energy. I mean, just pick your the coast to coast panoply of topics, okay?
Right.
But as people talk about those topics, you're correct, and I think our people who listen to this and watch it this will connect with them. You really can't hear anybody talk about those things without making the discussion spiritual. They all do that. Every one of them does that.
It has to become spiritual, yeah. And so it started. There was less pure quantum physics, quantum science, and it started getting into the science of the spirit.
They're using that to say something else in the spirit.
And so, but in and of itself, that was appealing too, because I knew that there was a spirit and a soul, and I was like, okay, well, maybe I'm starting to get somewhere with these explanations. But then the more I started reading other Gary Zukav, I'm like, this is sounding very Eckhart Tolle, It started becoming reminiscent of all the New Age stuff.
Finding Oprah.
Yeah. Man, totally soul someday. Yeah, it was. I absolutely. It started sounding exactly like all of the New Age stuff that I had been in. Manifesting your reality, but it just had a scientific twist to it, and which is smart. I believe people aren't buying into 100% materialism. They're starting to understand there is another realm, and so they're just kind of getting ahead of the game. I got really into ancient aliens for a while, but then even then I was like, I don't buy it. They're not physical beings, and so back to the philosophy paper. I guess at this point I'm not a Christian yet, but it's starting to make the most sense. And so I really started reading the Bible in earnest, but in a more research manner. But the word never comes back void.
Right. You're reading that like you're reading these other books.
Right. Yeah. Trying to find scripture that would validate quantum physics, kind of not the other way around.
Right.
And so I'm not going to lie, I didn't end up finishing the paper. It was not that it was too difficult, but at that point, I physically couldn't write down that I believed in Jesus Christ as my Savior. That was the most difficult aspect of it, really just being honest and confessing that.
What got you to that point?
Still a few more years. I mean, I wrote it but I didn't believe it, and I turned in a half-assed paper. And I mean, my philosophy professor, I actually consider him a Gandalf as well. He's a Christian and a doctor, and he was really trying to point me in the right direction, and saw how like earnest I was working at it, but struggling with it. And he, kind soul, gave me a 50 on it, and I ended up getting like a B with honors, which is kind of a slap in the face.
You made it through, yeah.
Right.
Well, you know, again, good professors will do that.
Yes.
You try to reward effort.
Yes. Kind of having a existential crisis, like while I'm in school, and at that point I had picked up the shack off of my bookshelf. My mom
This is really eclectic. You know?
I had floor-to-ceiling bookshelves that ranged from, like quantum physics to H.P. Lovecraft to The Shack.
Yeah.
And so I read it, and it broke me. It just wrecked me, because I'd never seen Jesus portrayed that way. Just as... No, I'd never encountered a Christian that portrayed Jesus in that loving manner. And I was like, if that's really Jesus, like that's the Jesus that I want. And so at that point I was like, I want to be a Christian. Like, I just want to commit my life to Christ. I picked up the shack, and then
after you read it, who did you talk to someone? Did you read something else? I mean, where did you go? I mean,
I talked to my mom.
Okay.
And I had a boyfriend at the time, and he was not having any of it. He wasn't too stoked on it. So I couldn't really talk to him. At that point, I just kind of started searching for a church. I was like, I need to be somewhere. Like, I need community. I need to be, but I still had these beliefs that I knew to be, like, there's still quantum physics. There's still something to do with aliens. Like, I've never heard, anybody in church talk about this sort of thing. So I'm not going to even fit in church.
Right.
I just kind of started reading the Bible on my own. And then my best friend got pregnant, and I went online and I started looking for a pregnancy support group. She wasn't going to have an abortion. And so I found one at this church that was like 45 minutes away, that also happened to be my boyfriend at the time's, where his cousin worked. So I was like, okay. So we drove out there. She went to her meeting, and they had a worship service that night, and again, just completely wrecked. And I was like, yeah, this is where I belong. This is home. I tried to go to other churches in my neighborhood. God just kept the door shut. That's where he wanted me. And did I have a job? I didn't really have a job at this time. And so I really wanted to work in the bookstore. I was like, what better place to work than a Christian bookstore at this point?
Right.
And so I started volunteering first. And then when I started working there was just this like amazing old couple that worked there, like my spiritual grandparents. And I heard him talking, and I walked over, and he said something, and I was like, oh, you're talking about transhumanism. And he's like, his jaw dropped. He's like, how do you even know that word? I was like, how do people not know that word? And so he's like, you need to like watch Chuck Missler. And then he was like, Skywatch TV, all these people. And I was like, Tom Horn, that sounds really familiar. Yeah. I was like, holy crap, that's the book I have on my shelf. So yeah, I started watching Chuck Missler, and I was like, oh my gosh, so I can have both. Like, there is a unification of worldviews, and it makes way more sense from a Christian perspective.
Yeah. Well, that's pretty neat because, this is kind of what we're trying to do with Fringe Pop. That there are all these topics, all these subjects, some of them are more serious than others. You get a lot of silliness, put in there, but there's a lot to think about. And, typically Christians don't assign importance to it. They don't feel that it's worthwhile in any sort of, time sense to devote any attention to it at all. They can't see any connection. They just can't, why would you even bother?
Right.
That sort of thing. And
Absolutely.
And again, in my experience, it can be anything from, well, this subject freaks me out and I don't want to think about it, to, well, I can't pin a Bible verse to this, and so there can't be anything to it. And when you start thinking those things, rather than, again, get the bigger picture, like we were talking a few minutes ago about when you start thinking about the other side and then you start assigning intelligence to it, and then that creates one question after the other, and eventually you stumble back into a biblical worldview.
Right.
But unless you sort of are willing to put any of that kind of thought into any of these subjects, and to really get there, you actually have to spend a little time thinking about them. So a lot of Christians aren't even willing to invest the time there, but when they do, there are ways to think about these things as believers. And I think even if there wasn't, there are so many people out there who are thinking about them.
Yeah.
And are just like you. They have these questions. They might have some sort of Christian background, maybe no background at all, but they're assigning importance, right or wrong, they're assigning importance to these things. And if Christians aren't talking about them or even willing to talk about them and can't talk about them intelligently, then what do you got?
I think that's why we're losing the younger generation. They have been brought up in this supernatural worldview. From Harry Potter, like, you can't ignore it. You walk into the teen fiction section at Barnes and Nobles, and it's all vampires and werewolves and witches and zombies. And so subconsciously, they already know that this world exists, but nobody's talking about it in the church. And so
this is actually, again, this is not your imagination. Okay, this is actually an academic discussion. There's a good book. It's probably 10 years old now. It's by Christopher Partridge, called The Re-Enchantment of the West.
I feel like I've heard of it before.
He actually has 2 volumes, but the first one is again really worth reading, because his whole thing is as society gets more secular, like intentionally like kicking God out of everything.
Right.
That actually doesn't lead to secularism.
No.
It actually leads to this, he uses the term re-enchantment, because there's this God-shaped void, in people. And so they try to understand the world materialistically, and then they start assigning, consciousness. Like they start assigning spiritual qualities and attributes to these things, like artificial intelligence, transhumanism. If you spend any time thinking about how some of these movies are done that focus on these things, artificial intelligence and transhumanism, the filmmakers always want to turn the discussion into something spiritual, about personhood, about consciousness, about self-awareness. Those are inherently spiritual topics. And you have to have something, and again, for lack of a better way to put it, you got to have something else going on inside that is in some way separate just from a bunch of neurons, firing. I mean, and they sort of instinctively know that.
Absolutely.
They kind of have this dualistic instinct, but yet they want a totally materialistic world, but they can't escape it.
And I think that's why they're grasping onto things like quantum physics.
Yeah.
And
because it transcends the material world that we think we understand.
Exactly.
Well, this is really an important discussion to have. And if you really think about, again, this whole materialism that tries to not be materialistic.
Right.
I mean, that is kind of a sweet spot for what we're trying to do, on Fringe Pop, and just, what the church needs to be doing.
Absolutely. I mean, the conversation is ongoing, and Christians need to join it. Otherwise, we're just going to continue to lose people by the droves because they're going to search for answers elsewhere, just like I did.
Yeah. Well, we appreciate it. Thanks for being on and being subject to the interview. It was really good.
Absolutely.
Glad to
Thanks
hear
for
it.
having me.
Yep.